Hello, everyone. This is Stefan Bertram and Ben Burgess coming to you for Philosophy for People. This week, we're going to be discussing class reductionism and the new charge of class abstractionism. And I was just wondering if I could manage to convince it that my jumper is actually a green screen.
There you go.
There you go.
Well, my wall of the coffee shop is a real wall of the coffee shop.
I've never done virtual backgrounds before, but I quite like the idea. We were just fiddling on with the settings, worrying about Ben's video. So what we've done is bravely downgraded to 720p, which I'm sure everyone will survive. Slightly less resolution in our faces.
Yeah. Yeah, the internet might not be amazing here, so I am deep in Rosarito, Baja California, Mexico. Jason and I were going to a flea market here earlier, and then we walked up to this coffee shop and actually got here in the nick of time to do the show. But then I think the coffee shop Wi-Fi might not be great, but yeah, whatever. We're gonna try it.
Is Jason just off screen?
Jason is indeed just off screen, yes.
exciting lore for all the watchers. It was a long one this week, Ben. Long article this week.
Yeah, so it was. I'm not trusting this. Hold on.
He's gone. So yeah, this article this week is on class reductionism. The reductionist in this case is meant to be Ben, among other people. Ben and Vivek Chiba, who's someone we discussed before on here and on various TIR and give them an argument stuff. And kind of their critics in this way have kind of developed an account where they acknowledge that, yeah, the charge of class reductionism doesn't really make sense. So they've developed a new charge, which is the charge of class abstractionism, which I struggled to follow exactly, and is noted in the article is not exactly clear on what it is, but I believe it is a contrast between the idea of, okay, so the critics of Ben and Chiba and Jacobin and so on will acknowledge the idea that class is primarily structural, like class is primary in terms of determining how a society should go. And of course, if you don't acknowledge that, then you've thrown out the Marxism with the bathwater. But class abstractionists want to make a distinction between terms of class in terms of structural importance versus kind of strategic significance. That just because we acknowledge that class is primary in terms of structure, it doesn't mean that we have to strategically follow a class-based, class-first strategy.
Yeah, so I came in midway through. Right. So, I am trying something different. So the Wi-Fi at the cafe should be quite upstream. Hotspot.
So far, it's infinitely worse than whatever you're doing before.
Okay. In that case, switch back.
What do they say about like leftist production quality or leftist audio quality or leftist video quality? Oh, you look great now, Ben.
Okay. All right. I'm going to experiment with moving. Let's see how this works.
We're going on an exciting adventure, everyone.
I know. And you get to be part of it.
Buy the Wi-Fi router.
Yeah. All right. Let's see if I sit here. It might be a little closer to the the source of the Wi-Fi, and maybe we'll freeze up less. Who knows?
You look great so far.
Well, in any case, now that I am cautiously optimistic that this might actually work for a minute, I should say that that the essay this week is a follow-up to something I put out a little while ago. The one a little while ago was called "On the Charge of Class Abstractionism," and that was the transcript of a talk I gave at the Caucus for New Political Science conference in Texas. It was based on my a paper that I'm writing with Michael Seckman, and this, as you say, is response to this idea of class abstractionism. And the people who talk about class abstractionism, who are Michael McCarthy, his co-author through Dasan, and then this other guy, William Clare Roberts, we've talked about here before, who wrote a follow-up paper that was expanding on the concept. They, as I think I heard you sort of summing up before, say, okay, class reductionism isn't exactly right, but these people who are often accused of class reductionism, they are making some sort of mistake about how they're thinking about class, and we think we could better capture that mistake with this concept of class abstractionism. So just at a view from 10,000 feet, the original thing on the charge of class abstractionism was me, based on my paper with Michael Seckman, sort of saying, I don't think this updated version works either. There are all these problems with it. And then one of the authors of the original paper we were responding to responded a little bit on social media. It was kind of the first response from anybody in that camp. And so I thought, you know what? I don't want to just talk about this on social media. I want to write something substantive where we could really get into this. But as I started to do it, I thought, okay, it would be really easy for this to just get hopelessly in the weeds, right? That this is, my response to this other guy's response to my response to something that was said in some academic papers that most people who are going to read this have no context for. And so it could just look like a bunch of people who, basically probably when you get right down to it, agree on more things than not, who are getting mad at each other for obscure reasons having to do with what seem like some very technical distinctions. And really, at the end of the day, who gives a shit, right? And so I did not want it to come off that way, which is part of the reason that it's so long, because I wanted to mostly frame the essay around the bigger issue. Like, okay, what's at stake in all this? Why should anybody care about any of this? What's the, what are people really getting at when they talk this way? And, to try to foreground all of those kinds of issues. And so then, like, when I did get into some of the more technical distinctions, it would be within that larger context. And with any luck, readers who haven't been following this whole thing back and forth will actually give a shit and, care enough to sort of follow the technical details of that part, right? So, man, I'm gonna have to stop wearing this thing. It is true that libertarians and sort of related fringe right-wing people often do really like leather jackets. I will say they more often seem to like the Matrix style long leather jackets. This is just
I was
normal
literally
short
about
one.
to say, like, we live in the Matrix, bro. As opposed to your more biker style.
Yeah, see, that's what people think when they see me. I'm sure of it. Yeah. But in any case, it's so yeah. I mean, what I wanted to kind of start this off by thinking about is, all right, so class abstractionism, like once you use that phrase, you're already a little bit in the weeds. You know, you're talking about this. Well, the original
Did they make
McCarthy
it
and
up? Did they
Basant.
coin it?
Yeah. I'm 99% sure they coined it. Yeah, they did. They have so because I saw there was a Red May event that McCarthy and Roberts were both participants in, where McCarthy said when he and Dasan like sort of sat down to write the paper, their original goal was to talk about class reductionism and to sort of do like a rigorous examination of class reductionism. And then, you know, I think they quite correctly came to the conclusion that, oh, actually, um, it's like class reductionism is a bit of a mess as a concept. It doesn't really map onto the views that people it's supposed to describe. So far, I'm with them. But then they're like, okay, so here's the more precise charge, which is class abstractionism. And I'm fairly sure that this is something that they came up with. And in fact, if you look for, you know, for example, at Soren Mao's book, Mute Compulsion, which came out the same year as the class abstractionism paper. I quote this in a footnote. Uh, you know, Mao doesn't have the phrase class abstractionism yet, but there's a part of it where he's clearly kind of trying to get the same idea across, right? He just uses, I mean, slightly different language. I'm sure we'll circle back to that. But I mean, I think that, so I think this is something they coined in 2023, and then William Clare Roberts sort of took up the concept and ran with it in his own essay about this. So all of which is just to say, okay, if you're talking about class abstractionism, you're talking about these two papers which definitely made a splash among a certain kind of Marxist academic, but probably nobody else is really familiar with it, right? So the effort I was making in the essay is to pull in people who are not attuned to this like very niche debate that I'm talking about, but who probably have, for example, seen people throw around charges of class reductionism. And what I really wanted to do in that first part of the essay is to say, okay, well, let's think about the problems with that phrase, class reductionism. What would that mean
Right,
if
and
you
I think
took it
that's the
literally?
important thing to cover here, right? Like, because obviously
Yeah,
the people in this debate have
yeah,
decided that class reductionism doesn't go through, but I'm sure if the people, even the
yeah,
people in the watching, will either think it could be a real thing or at least know lots of people who do. So,
yeah, exactly, right? So, you know, because the sort of particular academics, the debate that I'm interested in, it's sort of accepted as common ground that, you know, that class reductionism is a bit of, you know, a bit of a, God, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, right? You know, it's, but you know, it's a bit of a canard, right? Like that they're really, this is
I
just
was going to
not
say
a well,
shibboleth.
this is just not a well-defined concept that actually describes a real thing, you know, at least in the way that it thinks it does. Uh, but if you go on to just sort of left-wing social media or, you know, IRL kind of left spaces, tons of people think this is a real thing, right? Many of your favorite, you know, not mine, but you know, you watching, right? You know, like your favorite podcasters may think this is a real thing, etc. Right? Uh, so, uh, I mean, God, you know, I remember when Francesca Florentini was on TIR, and she was like, you know, and she was throwing around, you know, this phrase, for example. So one of the things I tried to do is to try to say, okay, on the one hand, yeah, look, I do think this is a canard, but I also want to take this seriously enough to not just kind of be very literal about it and say, hey, here's what reductionism is. So here's what class reductionism would have to be. So what on earth are you people talking about? I mean, I could do that. I kind of do some of that in the essay, but I think maybe that's not the most useful way to do it because I don't think it really intersects with what people are trying to get across when they use that phrase, right? So I was trying to like think a little bit more sympathetically about what, at least in my sort of experiences having conversations with grassroots socialists who think that class reductionism is a thing, when, like my first question in these conversations is always like, what does that term mean to you? Right. And listening to what people say in those conversations, it seems to me that what they're, even if they don't exactly think of it this way, what they're really getting at when they throw that around is kind of a normative political distinction that, like really like a moral distinction, which is that, class reductionists are people who just talk about class and are not intersectional. That this is the language that I hear a lot of people using. Now, intersectional is also a word that has a technical meaning that's totally irrelevant to what they mean, because I mean, it's, that's not a dig. It's just, like lots of words start out having more technical meanings, and then when they kind of make it into more popular usage, they mean something that's not quite the same thing or is like looser.
Yeah, intersectional is when you like think about racism and classism and sexism at roughly the same time, or you care about them or whatever, in terms of how it's used in the discourse.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I mean, intersectional originally meant like it was about the intersections between forms of prejudice or discrimination. So like,
well, now it seems in public discourse to be more about the intersections in your mind, as everything like journeys towards becoming more personal.
Yeah, because in the original usage, the sort of thing that people like Kimberly Crenshaw had in mind was like specific discrimination against Black women, right? Like that, like they're not, like somebody who's discriminated against Black women who wouldn't necessarily discriminate against white women or Black men, right? That this isn't quite captured by just talking about racism or sexism. There's this other thing at the intersection of it. But that's, as you say, that's just not at all what people mean now, right? What people mean in popular usage when they say intersectional, what it's sort of been telephone gamed into meaning is carried in the right way, being invested in the right way in different kinds of concerns about oppression and injustice, prejudice, etc. Right?
Psychologicalized and personalized as everything is these days.
Yeah. So, like people say, your feminism isn't intersectional if you're only interested in, I don't know, abortion and equal pay or whatever, and you're not interested in these things about racism. That would be the sort of thing that people often say, and so when people say in these conversations, class reductionists are these socialists or Marxists who want to talk about class, but they're not intersectional. What they mean, I don't think this is a caricature. I think this is actually the model that people have in their heads when they talk about this. Is, well, the class reductionist is somebody who sort of checks the cares about class-based injustice box, but perversely refuses to check the cares about racism box or the cares about sexism box. And this really is, I think, once you kind of realize that that's what people really mean when they say class reductionist, a lot of stuff comes into focus, because if you're taking it really literally, then it's very easy to just be like, what the hell are you talking about? Because, a reduction, I mean, certainly in like philosophy of science, a reductionist about something is somebody who who thinks, like, if you're an A reductionist, that means that you think that apparent instances of A are actually nothing above and beyond instances of B. Like, if you're a reductionist about the special sciences, that means that you think that chemistry and biology, are like the sort of propositions of chemistry and biology are nothing above and beyond sort of very complicated propositions about basic physics. Or if you're a reductionist in the philosophy of mind, you're like a reductive physicalist, that means that you think that propositions about mental states, right, don't refer to anything above and beyond sort of complicated sets of physical states. And so, taken really literally, I mean, first of all, the phrasing would be odd because class reductionist makes it sound like you're reducing class to something else. But even putting that aside, right, taken really literally, a class reductionist about race or gender would be somebody who is saying that apparent instances of racial or gendered phenomena are really nothing above and beyond sort of instances of class exploitation or something like that. Right? And in fact, I mean, I don't say this in this essay, but something I said in the previous one is one of the funny things, if you think about this, is that there are trends in sort of academic Marxist thought that do almost sound like class reductionism in that sense, that are sort of attempts to sort of say, oh, what's really going on with race or gender stuff, we can kind of theorize all of this in the sort of categories of Marxian political economy, but the kinds of Marxist academic work that do that are not at all the kinds that get accused of class reductionism.
Right, because so if you say that, then that's the excuse to do Black Lives Matter instead of like working class organizing, because it just is class stuff. It all is class stuff.
Yeah, am I back?
Yep, I don't. You were only gone while I was speaking, so.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I think I got most of that, but yeah, no, that's exactly right. The people who do that, it's actually the other way around. The people who do that are taken to be the furthest thing from class reductionists, because doing that is in fact often a way of signaling that you really want to that you really do care about these things. So, like, for example, socialist feminist social reproduction theory, right? That's like all about attempts to sort of understand gender in terms of gendered division of labor, and sort of integrate that into a Marxist economic analysis, or even like racial caste theory that says that race in the United States is actually this kind of caste that's like this sort of odd semi-class category. These are both attempts to sort of explain what race or gender is within this Marxist economic concept, which would, if you really took the charge of class reductionism literally, that would actually be class reductionism. But exactly as you said, people who make these moves are actually the ones who are considered the furthest thing from class reductionists, because trying to sort of integrate it into your Marxist economic framework is a way of signaling the opposite. It's a way of signaling, no, I am checking those boxes. See, I care about that stuff enough to sort of integrate it into my core theoretical framework. So if you take class reductionism literally, then it's like, yeah, what the hell are you talking about? Nobody who's accused of being a class reductionist says that, race or gender are really just disguised forms of class. And whereas if you realize that what people are really saying, like what they're really trying to express when they throw around this term class reductionist, is, oh, you want to talk about class, you're not intersectional enough, by which they mean you're not really checking these other boxes, then it starts to make a lot more sense. Now, my basic argument is that the claim that, kind of putting aside, I think you're very, fair concern that was implicit in what you said earlier, that there's a sort of over individualizing and psychologizing and all of this anyway, right? Like, why do we care so much about, what's in people's hearts? But even putting that aside, I think that what's really missing, even in this interpretation of what the class reductionism charge is how much of this, and we'll circle back to this later and maybe kind of try to fill in some of the details, but how much of this is actually a strategic debate about what to do about, racialized or gendered or et cetera, forms of injustice. That it's not that like, oh, some people care about them, these other people just perversely don't check that box. They don't care about them one way or the other. It's like, no, there's actually a disagreement here about what the most effective strategy is for dealing with these things. So, I think that I guess just to kind of quickly say a little bit of that, right? I mean, one way to think about this is, I know stagism is, for reasons I don't really understand, is a dirty word for some Marxist theorists that, they don't let, so I just read, for example, Jody Dean's book, Capital's Grave, where she repeatedly kind of trots out this thing, oh, look at people being stages, as like
the important stages are the 1905 revolution and then the 1917 revolution.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the idea that historical progress happens through stages, and you often have to do one before you can progress to another, is just historical materialism. I think that's actually correct, but in any case, like one form of stages, I would say, look, you do in fact have to struggle for and achieve certain kinds of like bourgeois liberal rights, before you're going to be in a good position to go further than that. I think that's true. I mean, I don't want to be too simplistic about it. I think there are situations in which, maybe you have to do some of this stuff at the same time or whatever, but like, it's certainly, I think that it is in fact true that, sort of, achievement of, voting rights and anti-discrimination and all that stuff. I think that is often something that you have to do, before going onward to bigger and better things.
But we already won those.
Yeah. Good job, guys. Yeah. Good work, team. Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. For the most part, that stuff is done. I think here and there are like rearguard battles to be fought, to preserve those liberal rights against, being taken away. I mean, I think here about, for example, the rollback of abortion rights in red states, et cetera, right? Like those things do happen, but by and large, right, viewed from 10,000 feet, if you live in a society like the US or the UK in 2025, putting aside any degradation of liberal democracy that's going on right now under Trump, by and large, right, those kinds of bourgeois liberal rights have been achieved, right? That we by and large, we have legal equality between different demographic groups, which is very good, very important. But then the question is, well, once we've won those battles, then I think lots of people, I mean, this is the part of like critical race theory, for example, that's totally correct. People will sort of correctly notice that it's like, oh, that didn't solve everything, right? That just sort of achieving formal legal equality didn't solve everything. And when this, and there could be different kinds of things that it didn't solve that you might be interested in. One could just be material disparities that, if you like coming out of the long shadow of Jim Crow, for example, you're going to get different rates of poverty or economic success between white people and black people in the United States. That would be an obvious example. And then, there could be other sort of more complicated harms that aren't eliminated just by achieving formal legal equality.
The informal inequalities of the social sphere, as put across by McIntosh in her account of privilege.
Yeah, right. And it's like, look, I have made fun of that woman extensively in the past, but she's not wrong about that, right? I mean, it's like that. I mean, she's not wrong that there are things that fall in. I mean, a lot of the things that she thinks does are insane if you read what she wrote, but at the level of description you just quoted, right? It's like, look, it's not wrong, right? There are various ways in which we can talk about everything here from sort of patterns of gender relations, where, for example, many women may feel pressured to sort of accept, inegalitarian, distributions of domestic labor, right? That's like an obvious example. We could talk, about like genuinely social interactions, right? It's like that people, partially downstream of the material disparities, right? That you might have people in certain demographic groups more likely to be in positions of power, in workplaces, for example, and people in other groups being more likely to have to eat shit, in order to keep their job. That if your boss says some awful bigoted garbage and you just kind of have to sit there, right, and accept it. These are, everything
it's
that
pretty interesting though, right? That like the movements which are presumably being decried, like presumably there is like a movement, like a working class based movement that's being critiqued by intersectionality, and more vague claims of things like what we say now when we say intersectionality. But that movement was the movement which, in fact, achieved all these kind of universal bourgeois rights, while the kind of movement which then has been influenced post intersectionality seems a lot less impressive in terms of what it's achieved.
Yeah, I mean, look, that is definitely true. I mean, in fact, it's a small example, but I think it's a revealing one. I always think of, if you see, even in like a U.S. history textbook that you might have in high school, if you look at pictures of the 1963, right, March on Washington, which, by the way, you almost never see the full title, which is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The first conjunct tends to be disappeared. You'll see these like crowd pictures where you have all these people holding up printed out, like nicely printed signs. And, if you zoom in on the signs, right, all these signs, the March on Washington, you'll see UAW at the beginning, right? Because those are the people who
wow, I can't believe
signs,
it wasn't small businesses which printed.
What's that?
I can't believe it wasn't small businesses which printed them.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, look, that's just a small example of the way that these institutions that were built up with militant working class struggle. I mean, the sit down strikes in the 30s, were then able to, along, of course, with the black churches, to be the edifice that like maybe the second most important part of the northern support, at least for what was going on. But yeah, so okay, so so that's gonna be like one of my big claims here, that I think that people are missing the extent to which, all right, if you have various forms of injustice that might afflict or maybe disproportionately afflict members of historically marginalized groups, even after achieving a formal legal equality, that people who want to focus on sort of class-based economic organizing, rather than thinking, oh, what's going on here is they just don't care about any of that. An alternate explanation is that they actually think that sort of universalist economic solutions that we could achieve by sort of trying to appeal to the material interests of people across these different demographic groups is actually a better strategy for solving that problem. But that's what I think. Meanwhile, yeah, McCarthy and Stefan come along. This concept of class abstractionism. As I said, so there's this Soren Mao book that also made a big splash in 2023, Mute Compulsion, which doesn't have the phrase class abstractionism yet, but I just happened to be reading this part of the book earlier this week, which is why its example is fresh in my mind. Chapter 7 of the book, which is the chapter that's about race and gender and etc. There is a anticipation of the charge, so I assume Mao is in the same broad milieu as McCarthy and Stefan. Some of these ideas were kind of floating around there at the time, where he says, and it's an interesting argument because I think the first part is actually totally correct. Mao, and I'm going to keep feeling silly as I say that, but it's M-A-U. I think that's how you say it, Mao.
Yeah. I keep thinking you're talking the great helmsman.
Yeah. Not the most famous Marxist with a last name that's pronounced that way. But not Chairman Mao, but Professor Mao says, okay, there are all these attempts that people have made to sort of say, oh, actually, race, for example, is part of the racial oppression is built into the logic of capital, right? People who like to talk this way, or people do like equivalent things with gender or other things. And I think he makes a completely reasonable case when he's pushing back against that idea, that a lot of times when people talk this way, like if you really look at their arguments, they're just kind of refusing to engage in abstraction. That they're sort of not conceptually prying things apart because they're like, oh, capitalism actually happened this way. It's like, okay, fine, but that doesn't mean that like capitalism conceptually has to include racial inequality, for example. Clearly we can separate those things out. It's actually very easy to imagine a version of capitalism under slightly different historical circumstances that wouldn't include racial inequality. And a lot of times people make these weird arguments that's like, oh, well, actually, as like a good materialist, you just shouldn't worry about hypotheticals or whatever. That's like, no, you're being ridiculous right now. We can clearly conceptually separate these things. There's a reason that in Capital, Marx is always, people have the weirdest idea that like it's like un-Marxist to like thought experiments and considering weird hypotheticals. Capital is full of thought experiments and weird hypotheticals. That's I think Marx very correctly understood that like this is a really useful way of getting clear about distinctions. But in any case, so I think Mao is like totally right about all of that. But then he says, well, the reason that people want to say that white supremacy or whatever is part of the logic of capital is because they think that helps them push back against what Mao calls narrow-minded traditional Marxists who, want to counterpose class struggle to identity politics. And actually, the way you should oppose those people is just to say that we shouldn't be making conclusions about political strategy on the basis of this sort of general theoretical premises at this like very high level of abstraction. And this is essentially the move that Mao is making there, seems to be very much what McCarthy and Stefan are doing in the paper. Honestly, I think Mao's version is a lot clearer than what they say in the paper, which I will say I'm saying that as somebody who at this point has spent way too much of my life reading and trying to make sense of that paper. But people want to take a shot at it for themselves. There's a hyperlink in the essay. But basically what they say, and again, I don't want to straw man this, so let's start with what I think is the totally reasonable part of their intervention. That McCarthy and Desan do say this. I think this part is totally right. That okay, when you ask whether class is primary, we can distinguish between two kinds of primacy. Or even they say, look, this is the problem with the original charge of class reductionism. It's unclear what you're saying that the class reductionist is sort of saying is, the sense in which they're saying that class is primary. So there's structural primacy and there's political primacy. So structural primacy is sort of explanatory primacy in thinking about why capitalist society is the way that it is. And I know that's a little bit vague, but part of the reason I'm being a little bit vague about this is that honestly, I think the stuff they say about structural primacy in their paper is a bit of a mess. Because they're the definition they're using is derived from Eric Olin Wright, Andrew Levine, and Elliot Sober's book Reconstructing Marxism, which we've talked about before. But I mean, it's going to sound really petty, but I just think they really misread that book. That
which is a sad thing to happen, right? It means a lot of wasted effort has gone in on both sides.
Yeah. Because because the thing they're pulling out of that book as a definition of structural primacy, Wright, Levine, and Sober actually argue at length would not count as a kind of structural primacy. So I'm really not sure what got lost in translation there, but whatever, right? Forget that. They say so they have this particular definition they like, and Roberts kind of doesn't mention the Wright, Levine, and Sober book, but he does give essentially the same definition there. And that, that definition is class is primary in the sense that it sets the parameters that where within which other factors work. And again, Wright, Levine, and Sober have this whole argument that just saying there's a causal asymmetry, that two causes contribute in different ways to an effect. So one sets the parameters and the other chooses within those parameters. That by itself, that's not enough to show you that one is the main cause and the other isn't, right? If there's a bowl of fruit and it has apples and bananas in it, and you choose a banana, well, let's say it's both true that there were no pears in the bowl and that you don't particularly like pears. Which one of those is the main cause of you not choosing a pear? It's a little unclear, right? So,
great
so
analytic example.
Yeah,
Imagine this fruit.
So, yeah, history is a bowl of fruit, right? As they say. So yeah, so the important thing for our purposes, though, is that McCarthy and Desan say, okay, just about anybody in the Marxist tradition is going to say that there's some sense in which class is structurally primary in explaining things, the world as we see it around us. Again, I think once you really start to dig into exactly what that means, it gets messy, but they say it. And I think for our purposes today, we can just kind of take that as read and not nitpick that too much more. But they say there's a difference between this structural explanatory kind of primacy, right? Class explains why things are the way they are. And normative or like strategic political primacy. That the way that radicals should go about, politics in the here and now is to primarily focus on like broad-based economic appeals or speaking to people as workers or etc. Right, and so they want to differentiate these two things. And so there's a quote that they have in one of the footnotes that I mention a bunch of times because I think it's just sort of usefully vivid as far as keeping track of what we're even talking about here, which they pull out of David Roediger's book, The Wages of Whiteness, where Roediger says, if what is it, class or capitalism, right, is a tree, or what do they say? If racism is a particularly large and low-hanging
the branch
branch
thing.
from, then class may be the root, but oftentimes grabbing the branch, in many situations, grabbing the branches may be the best way to shake the tree.
Racism is a large, low-hanging branch of a tree that is rooted in class relations. We must constantly remind ourselves that the branch is not the same as the roots, and that the best way to shake the roots may at times be grabbing the branches.
Yeah.
I would say that's much worse than your fruit bowl analogy, because I can't imagine ever shaking a branch in such a way as to make the roots shake.
That is a very good point. Yeah, I should say I can't take credit for the fruit bowl analogy. It is in the that's from Reconstructed Marxism, but
right.
I may have changed the fruits because I don't actually remember which fruits were in the bowl in their example. But in any case, yeah, right. I mean, it's so, and it's like what also what like I think the more you think about this, actually, the more revealing an analogy this is. It's like, okay, if you don't like the tree, what's the point of shaking the branch? Like what's the point of, like, even if we could like somehow make the visual metaphor work here, right? Like if we could somehow shake the roots by grabbing the branch, which is like, man, that's a flimsy tree, but like even if we could, like, why are we trying to shake the roots? What does that do? Right? Like, presumably what we want to do would be to like cut down the tree or like, take it up, like dig it up by the roots or something. So I don't know what the shaking is for, but whatever. Putting that aside, it's yeah, it's very unclear to me, but whatever. It's like I said, it's still the case that it's probably one of, like, that quote is probably one of the clearest things in that paper for like helping you track the distinction between structural and political primacy. That they think, okay, even if they agree that for some sort of structural claim, right, that the roots of the tree that racism is the large low-hanging branch from are about class structure, so class is primary in that sense. It could be that when we're thinking about political strategy, that oftentimes it's best to grab the branches. And okay, so far this looks like it's just kind of a disagreement about, sort of strategic assessments of like, there we go. Back. Stefan?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're
very good.
definitely back.
Yeah. Well, Carlos says in the chat, when I was a kid, we used to run through the woods and pull down dead trees, and you would grab a branch, you would pull it out by the roots. So if the tree is dead, I guess this works.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true.
And also
that, once we kill the class system, it will actually be very easy to pull out the roots by the branches.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, in any case, okay. Sorry, I'm just getting paranoid right now about freezing.
You seem perfectly fine.
Okay, so yeah, so they,
You're on strategic concerns.
yeah, so this just seems like a straightforward difference in sort of strategic assessment of like what levers of power are available to, you know, radical dissidents and kind of advanced liberal capitalist democracies. But, and, you know, I think actually that's exactly the right way to have the debate is just be like, okay, this is a strategic difference, right? You know, here's how it seems to me that, you know, this strategy could work, and, you know, here's why I think it'd be more effective than that one, and whatever, just kind of have it in a very grounded way. But McCarthy and Desan said, no, these class abstractionists are like, they're making the mistake of just assuming that political primacy, that we're appealing to people in the first instance on the basis of class, is entailed by this like very abstract structural analysis of capitalism, and that's the mistake. And they only have one example of a class abstractionist in their paper, who's Vivek Chibber. William Clare Roberts in his paper expands that to also include Adolf Reed and various Jacobin writers, which I'll just awkwardly say include me. I make it into one of his footnotes.
Which amusingly enough, obviously, if you're like a MAGA communist or whatever, you think Jacobin is like maximally lib-cucked.
Oh my God, yeah, right. Like, you know, yeah. I mean, look, Jacobin is often all things to all people. You know, it's you know, if you're a very based internet communist, it's maximally lib-cucked. If you're one of these Marxist academics who's worried about class abstractionism, you know, it's you know, these are people who are, you know, super dismissive of, you know, of everything outside of, you know, this kind of narrow class analysis, etc. Right?
I was thinking, like, is there anyone that's actually a class reductionist? And so I was thinking about the MAGA communists or whatever, and it's like, no, because they're genuinely conservative. It's not that they are disinterested in social concerns. It's just they genuinely don't agree with at least some liberal positions.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that, like, that's not, like, yeah, it's not that they think the issue doesn't matter. They actually do think the issue matters. They just have conservative positions on it. Which, you know, is definitely a thing, right? I mean, this is like a little bit sideways to the discussion we're having today. But it's like, yeah, look, I do think there are going to be certain people who pop up in certain kind of left or left adjacent spaces who are going to be accused of class reductionism or whatever, where it's wrong for a different reason that it would be wrong to accuse Vivek Chibber or Adolf Reed of class reductionism, right? In the Chibber Reed case, it would be wrong because these are people who actually, like, do care about, you know, diminishing various forms of oppression. They just have this universalist strategy for achieving that. It's based on appealing to people on the basis of, you know, shared material interests. Whereas there are other people, you know, who are going to pop up who are like, no. These are people who are not checking the boxes that radical liberals want them to check, but they're not checking them because they have this, like, sort of materialist universal strategy. They're just not checking them because they have substantially opposite positions on the issue, right? I mean, these are just, you know, weird fusionists who, you know, who are like trying to combine, you know, trying to combine socialism with some form of social conservatism. That exists.
Or you know, they
I
perfectly
think
believe
fairly,
they are ticking. They perfectly believe they are ticking the woman box or whatever by trans bashing or whatever, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That would be a perfect case, right? That's like, yeah, they're not, you know, like, they're concerned about the issue of the status of women. They just have a very different position.
Yeah, they just disagree with you.
What,
they're not doing anything sneaky.
Yeah, exactly. But I think basically that if you look at if you look at the quotes they give, so in the like the textual evidence that they provide that Vivek Chibber is a class abstractionist, I think that there is a bit of a bait and switch here, because it seems to me that there is this pretty straightforward ambiguity in the phrase political primacy. So does political primacy mean that you think that the working class is the agent of historical change, that has the interests and capacities to bring about socialist goals? Or do you believe in political primacy in the sense of thinking that, well, the right way to achieve this is to appeal to people on the basis of material interest, to address them as workers, etc. And those are very closely related to each other, but they're not the same thing. They are logically detachable. And in fact, oftentimes McCarthy and Dassan sound like they're suggesting that they do still in some sense believe that the working class is the collective agent of historical change, but they just believe that like the way to activate it is to, like involves a lot of sort of particularist identity stuff in the short term that is somehow or another going to turn into class formation in the long term.
I always wonder this. Do they have an answer to the question of, well, it seems like we've done this already?
Not that I've seen.
Like, it seems that Trotskyites have been doing this for like half a century now.
Yeah. It's, and I also think that I haven't seen a lot of specificity about how this is supposed to go, right? Like how they imagine this process playing out in the long run. Like when and how will militant particularisms somehow transform themselves into socialist universalism, if that is indeed the long-term goal? Like they use these phrases that suggest that they think that some sort of such process is going to happen, but I think there's a fair amount of ambiguity there. Like they say things like, what is it? These other solidarities that texture the lived experiences of members of the working class, or there's other solidarities, the texture of people's lived experiences are the materials out of which class formation is made. I think that's a sentence in the paper. I think I'm getting that right. And again, I don't know what that means. If it doesn't mean that somehow or another particularist identity-based mobilizations will turn into sort of broad-based working class solidarity. But man, I really want some details about how that's supposed to work, because it's one thing to say, oh, it hasn't worked yet, but it's like I at least want some inkling of how it's supposed to work, which I really don't get there. But I think the reason that I don't get it in either of these papers is because the move seems to be, oh, well, the only reason why somebody would think that the way to activate the working class as an agent of historical change is to, just sort of skip straight to making broad-based material appeals, is because they think that the strategy is like entailed by these highly abstract structural premises about class. And I think that's a really bad assumption. And again, I also, I think that there are all sorts of really straightforward strategic arguments that actually appealing to people on the basis of broadly shared material interests and using that to try to bring about universalistic economic solutions is a much better strategy for social change, and even a much better strategy for social change, specifically to address the harms that the class, alleged class reductionist or abstractionist is often accused of paying insufficient attention to, right? So, like a nice, obvious example of that would be, go back to some of the examples I gave earlier. I mean, certainly, if we're interested in material disparities, right? I mean, this is the point that Adolf Reed has been making for decades. These debates about reparations and whatnot. That's like, if you want wealth redistribution to the Black poor, well, any sort of major program of wealth redistribution is inevitably going to come up against incredibly strong vested resistance from people who don't want their wealth redistributed. And you have a much better shot at overcoming that resistance if you can mobilize a majority of the population on your side. And you have a much better shot of mobilizing a majority of the population on your side if you're not only if the goal is not just to redistribute to some of them, right? I mean, if this is, if you're also if you're also doing this in tandem with poor and working class white people who would also benefit, right, for the redistribution. That's an obvious case. Or the gender case, that if you're concerned about, if you're concerned about the sort of unfair, distribution of domestic labor, even now in many households, whatever, then it's like, look, lots of people feel trapped. I mean, men and women, but lots of people feel trapped in relationships because they literally just can't afford to move out. If you give people more material resources, they're in a much better position to renegotiate that household social contract in miniature, into their liking, right? So you're actually, broad-based material egalitarianism is in fact more likely to lead towards more egalitarian gender roles. That's or even the case of the racist boss who has who's says who says disgusting things at work, and people feel like they have to they have to sit there and take it. It's like, look, in a society with less economic precarity, better labor protections, etc. I mean, never mind socialism, where we might have we might be just vote them off the workers' council or whatever, right? But it's even short of that, right? Just in society with less economic precarity, better labor protections, people would feel much more free to tell that guy to fuck off without worrying that they'd be destroying their livelihood. And so these are all pretty obvious, I think, sort of concrete strategic arguments that don't rely on just doing this straight line from the very abstract structural point to sort of concrete political strategy. And, I also think that if anything, the burden of proof should somewhat be on the people whose strategic assessments go the other way, right? Because if you do accept, I think there's a bit of a dilemma here, right? Because if what they're accusing the class abstractionist of abstracting from a structural analysis is just the who claim that the working class is the necessary agent of historical change, then okay, fair enough. That really does follow from pretty basic structural premises that the working class is the only element in society that has the capacities and the collective interest to bring this about. Yeah, that is structurally entailed. Fair enough. And when they provide textual evidence of Chibber being an abstractionist, what they're providing textual evidence of him deriving is just political primacy in that sense. But if they're denying political primacy in that sense, I don't understand the claim that they're making an intervention from within Marxism, because I think if you're rejecting the claim that the emancipation of the working class has to be carried out by the working class, that nobody else can do it for you. I think that's pretty basic to anything that's recognizable to me as a form of Marxism. And on the other hand, if you're saying, oh, actually, we do accept the historical agent claim, that kind of political primacy, we're just rejecting political primacy in the sense of like the how question, that like, how is this agent of historical change activated? That we don't think that, in the first instance, you should necessarily be appealing to people on the basis of like broad-based shared material interests. You should be appealing to them on the basis of, whatever, like maybe a lot of times identity stuff. You should be grabbing the branches. Well, if that's what you think, one, like, it's a little bit of a confusing combination of positions. I don't think it's like logically inconsistent, but I think it's not obvious why that would be true, right? Like, it's like, okay, maybe we can Rube Goldberg our way to class consciousness by like some sort of complicated strategy involving a lot of identity politics in the near and medium future. But I want to hear a lot more about how that like mechanism is supposed to work, because on the face of it, it doesn't sound like it will. As you were kind of indicating, past experience doesn't seem particularly promising in terms of how this has played out, before. So I think actually like the burden of proof should very much be on them to like make concrete strategic arguments for this. I think there are lots of concrete, strategic arguments on the other side. But like the biggest thing I'd just say is like, look, I think there is, despite everything I've said, I think there is like a serious debate to be had about this stuff. I've obviously got pretty clear views about what I think about it, but like, look, I think there are ways that somebody on that side of the argument could not crazily push back against some of what I've said, right? Like you could say, for example, that, actually, you have to work on changing attitudes first rather than trying to change material conditions first, and so the attitudes will then be influenced by that, which is what I think, right? Like you have to like focus on trying to change attitudes first, because otherwise, to go back to the sort of domestic labor example that I used earlier, that like maybe like sexist men will realize that a more egalitarian distribution of wealth will lead to more equal gender roles, and they'll like resist it.
There's two critiques of kind of the woke focus on kind of attitudinal stuff, which is on one hand, maybe you reject that stuff entirely, but on the other hand, maybe you critique it because it's hectoring and kind of done in the wrong way rather than rejecting in of itself.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, it's
the comments are bickering about whiteness. If you're looking over there,
I was looking at that. I was trying to figure out what was going on there. So, yeah, I think. So yeah, I think that it's so look, if you want to say, for example, oh, you have to like work on changing sexist attitudes first, otherwise, too many men will oppose this stuff because they'll realize the implications for gender equality because they're sexist attitudes, or you can make parallel arguments about race, etc. Then it's like, look, empirically, I just don't think that's true, right? I actually do think the much more promising strategy is to initially appeal to people on the basis of shared material interests.
But also, then, if the problem is attitudes, then apart from maybe like a backslide in the past like 5 to 10 years, surely now is the best time to have done the attitude stuff and to get onto the rest. Like, it's not like, or do we seriously think that like men in the past were less sexist?
Yeah, clearly not, right? Yeah, I mean, the attitudes are already better than they've ever been. I mean, if we did a survey of what all Americans thought about gender, for example, in 1975, and we did a survey of just what people who voted for Donald Trump think about gender in 2025, you'll get much more enlightened attitudes in the 2025 survey, right?
And of course, that has a lot to do with kind of feminist struggle, and a lot of feminist struggle, which is like elite feminist struggle. But the thing is, it's like, well, okay, at some point, can we get on? Like, can we go somewhere?
Yeah, totally. And look, to the extent that you do still want to, like, you think that work still remains to be done on the attitudes. It seems to me that, especially when you think about, like, okay, what can the left do, right? Because it's one thing to say, oh, what can, like, major shapers of cultural opinion do, right? That might be a slightly different discussion, right? But, like, what can like the left do with the levers that are available to us? I think, like, you can yell at people to have better attitudes, but I'm just not very optimistic about that paying off, honestly. I think a much more promising strategy is to appeal to people on the basis of the material interest. It's like, oh, this is how it's going to help you, and then use that, like, what the sort of biggest, most promising, strategically best positioned mass of the public has in common, and to use that to get them to achieve things that we think will have knock-on effects that will be better in terms of reducing all these other harms, right? Or even, like, I don't know. I mean, I think even so, I think in two ways, right? I think one is that the actual process of struggling for better outcomes often actually leads to better attitudes. I often think here of the 1980s James Earl Jones flick, Mattawan, which is about the coal miners unions. It's the coal wars in West Virginia in the 1920s. Right. This is a time and a place where attitudes towards race are, like, almost unfathomably less enlightened than they are anywhere in the United States in 2020s, right? But I think the movie kind of very correctly and accurately depicts this process whereby people admit that it's like, okay, we've got to let these, like, black workers in the union, or else they're going to be used as scabs, and, like, that's going to be really bad for us. And so, you kind of start with.
Hello? You seem fine to me.
Yeah. Okay. It looked like it was frozen up for a second, but yeah, you start with the the appeal to material interests, and then the process of working together towards a common goal actually does a lot to help with the attitudes. I think there's some pretty concrete empirical evidence that works. Like, there's a New York Times article that I hyperlink in the essay that shows, that, like, mentions the studies that show that labor organizing actually does much more to reduce racial antagonisms in the workplace than DEI trainings do, for example. I think that that's often a very effective strategy, and I also just think that it's very often the case that if you actually achieve some of the material goals, right, that in various ways that we talked about earlier, right, that can help diminish these extra economic harms. So again, that's my view. I'm perfectly happy to have the empirical debate about whether we need to, like, focus more for the next 20 years on changing attitudes, and then maybe have class solidarity after that. I'm very skeptical about that, but that's again, that's an empirical debate. I'm happy to have that. But I just think that this class abstractionism thing is just a total straw man, and it's kind of a distraction from what the actual debate is about.
Reasonable. What are you thinking about doing for next week, Ben?
Well, next week I am going to be gone. I'm going to be in.
And then in terms of
I'm going to
writing,
be.
you're going to be doing that.
Yeah, I'm going to be in Michigan. I will. I am going to. So I've been trying. I actually didn't do it last summer, but I've been trying once a year to meet up with a couple of my best friends I've stayed in touch with from high school. One of them has a cabin by the lake at. I swear to God, I'm not making this up. It's actually Crystal Lake in Michigan.
Cool.
But I've been there many times and I haven't been slashed yet, so I'm cautiously optimistic. So I'm going to be doing that, and then I'm going to be like the pre-convention speaker at the Detroit DSA convention the next week. So I'm going to be out of commission. In fact, I'm kind of on the fence about this right now, but I might even cancel and reschedule tomorrow's show because I'm getting ready to leave and I'm racing to get done with some other writing before then. But there will be a Substack next Sunday, not by me, but it is going to be a guest essay written by that man. So he has already written a draft of it. So we should run that next Sunday. It's going to be about authenticity and selling out, sort of core Milesian themes. So,
does Jason want to just do the show with me on Sunday?
Maybe you should ask him.
I could just shout. I could just say that very loudly. You might probably hear.
Well, I'd have to take out my
okay. Very, very loudly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's you know what? There you go.
Jason. Was that loud enough? Oh, of course, Ben just froze at the same time.
Are we back?
Yes.
I know.
Fantastic timing.
Are we back?
Yep, you're back.
Okay. Well, I don't know what happened with the sound here, but I'm not going to worry about it right now.
Cool.
Here, I'll go put my earphones back in.
I think all your experiments today have gone very badly, Ben. Cool. Well, I will ask Jason if he wants to come and do the show next week. I was thinking about if I should do something myself, but it probably wasn't going to happen. So
yeah,
I might
we'll see if Jason wants.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if Jason wants to do that.
Do it be better.
All right, fair enough.
Bye.
Bye.